Welcome to another Center for Agriculture Profitability webinar from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I am Randy Sainer, a livestock systems extension educator based in Lincoln County. A full schedule of upcoming webinars as well as an archive of every past webinar is available on the center's website at cap.unl.edu. Today we'll hear about strategies and considerations for determining what is fair in cow leasing, including the advantages and disadvantages of cow-calf share and cash lease agreements. This is the time of year when these leases are often initiated or renegotiated, and the webinar will cover important points about the value of what the cow owner provides and what the person who cares for the cow provides in the production of weaned calves, as both parties work toward equitable agreements. We invite you to type any questions in the Q&A or the chat. Presenting today is Aaron Berger, a livestock systems extension educator with UNL, who is based in Kimball County. Aaron, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Randy. So as Randy said, as we go through, if you have questions, he's going to be monitoring the Q&A and the chat box. And so go ahead and type those in. Randy, just feel free to stop me if there's a question that comes in that we can address on. We'll also have some time at the end if you want to save your questions for then. So whichever is best from your perspective, just go ahead and do that, and we'll seek to get your questions answered. So we are going to talk about cow-calf share or cash lease agreements today. And whenever we talk about this or I share about it, I want to make sure I give credit where credit's due. And so I'm going to share a lot of thoughts today based off of knowledge and experience I've gained from people I've worked with who've gone before me, who've done quite a bit of work in this area. So first, Dick Clark is a long retired agricultural economist. He was based at the West Central Research and Extension Center, did some early work looking at this cow-calf share and cash lease agreements. Another one who in the beef industry is well known, Harlan Hughes, was an ag economist at North Dakota State University, a professor emeritus now, wrote for Beef Magazine, did a lot with annual cow cost, cow-calf cost of production, and he's done some good work on this topic. And then Matt Stockton, who's an agricultural economist at the West Central Research and Extension Center now. He's a co-creator of a calculator spreadsheet, which he and Roger Wilson, who's now retired, put together. I'll talk more about this spreadsheet in the presentation. It's basically a two-page spreadsheet, but does a real nice job of allowing both the cow owner and the person taking in cows or caring for cows to go in and put in their numbers and come to what would be a fair or equitable arrangement based on the value of what each party contributes. So really have gained value from those individuals and appreciate the contributions they made to the content I'm going to share today. So sometimes I'll have this conversation with folks. I'll share with them I'm doing some work on this topic, and they'll say, "Why would you lease cows? How does that work?" They've heard of leasing equipment or heard of leasing a car or a pickup, but how would you lease a cow? And why would you do that? And so I think as we talk about this topic, in my mind, the primary reason why we look at lease agreements is just the capital investment that's required today to be involved in cow-calf production. So if you think about the land that the cows are grazing and running on, you think about the equipment, and then you think of the value of the cows themselves, we can be talking millions of dollars when we look at what is required today to run, 300, 400, 500 cows. Millions of dollars. And so as we look at people getting into the business today, just the capital investment required is really large. And one of those big capital investments is cows. And so if we think about, maybe the average cow value today in a herd is $2,500. If we're looking at, just even 100 cows, that's $250,000. You take that out to 300 cows, that's $750,000. It's just a big amount of money. And so that really drives the interest, I think, for people to look at lease agreements so they might have the opportunity to retain that asset if they're the cow owner, or to control the asset if they're their operator and not have to come up with the cash themselves. The other thing I see is just the average age of producers in Nebraska and across the United States. You look at the Census of Ag. I have the privilege of serving Banner County also. That's one of the counties I serve here in the South Panhandle, and they have the the reputation of having the oldest average age for farmers and ranchers of any county in the state. And that's pushing over 60 there for them. Well, if you think about that, if that's the average age, there's a significant number of producers that are older than that. And so those folks are often looking at situations where maybe they're ready to step back from the day-to-day management and labor and transition a cow herd to somebody else, but they'd like to do that over time. And so I think that's why it's of interest from that generation. Also, I would just say, as I already mentioned, there's a lot of folks that like to get started in this business. And so they're trying to figure out a way to get a foothold in the door. And to go buy land, to go buy cows, equipment is sometimes just really prohibitive. So this provides an opportunity for a beginning producer, someone who maybe doesn't have much capital, to get started in the business and not have to have the cash. I also see this often used as a ranch business transition tool as we look at long established family operations. Maybe we have a daughter or son who'd like to be involved, come back to the ranch, take over the ownership and management of the cow herd. Maybe you have a scenario where it's a long-term family ranch and the land may be owned by multiple family members. And so this is a way for the older generation to transition the operating part of the business, the cow herd and maybe the equipment, to the next generation over time. And then they can work into ownership of the ranch land or a portion of that as they can have possession of the cow herd and the equipment. Another one that's come up frequently here recently, and this is always an issue, but I've had a number of questions on this recently, is tax planning and management. So if you think about a cow herd today, again, $2,500 maybe on average for cows. If you were going to sell a cow herd, what would be the tax implications of that? This is a situation where I see some people would like to ease out. They'd like to take that income over a number of years, not take it all as a lump sum, so they don't want to have the taxes from that. If this taxes are an issue for you, or you're thinking about making that decision from a tax perspective, I'd really encourage you to sit down with your tax preparer and really talk through what are your options. So you might be thinking about selling the cow herd now. If that's a raised cow herd, you would be paying capital gains. If it's a purchased cow herd, that's going to look differently depending on the cost of those cows and how you sell them. If you're in a cash lease agreement, that can change your status maybe in terms of if you're filing Schedule F or not. If you're in a cow-calf share agreement, you definitely can. And so make sure you visit with your tax preparer as you consider an agreement to just recognize and understand the implications of entering into either a cash lease or share agreement. So let's talk about the two common options, which is a cash lease or a cow-calf share, and we'll compare and contrast what I see as being the strengths, weaknesses of these two options. So as we think about a cash lease versus a cow-calf share, let's first look at a cash lease. And I'm going to first look at the owner's perspective. In this situation, the cow owner is going to get cash for the bred female that they deliver to the operator for usually them to run for 1 year. So, typically in Nebraska, most cows are spring calving cows, and we often see an initiation of a agreement or the renewal of agreement this type of year. So if I'm the cow owner, let's say I've got 100 cows and someone wants to lease those from me, I'll deliver those cows to the owner, say on November 1st. That's when our lease agreement starts. And then they're going to pay me a cash amount for that cow. Now that might be all the cash up front. Maybe that's half the cash now, half the cash, midway through the year, or even in the fall when the calves are sold. But the nice thing about this, it's known income for me as the owner. I have less risk. So I don't have production risk or price risk on those calves. And it's very simple. I get a cash amount at set times for those cows I delivered. The disadvantage to me is that I've got less income potential. So by giving up risk, I should expect to get a lower return. And so if I'm not participating in production risk or price risk for those calves, I should expect to potentially get less dollars in a cash lease than I would in a share agreement. The other thing is, if I want to maintain the cow herd and I really have genetics I like and I want to keep heifers back, if I cash lease those, unless I've set some agreement up with the person who's leasing those cows that I have first right to buy X number of heifer calves, all of those heifer calves belong to the cow operator. They've cash leased the cows, all the calves are theirs. And so that's that's kind of some advantages and disadvantages of the cash lease from an owner's perspective. From an operator's perspective, the advantage for them is they have total control in terms of management decisions. Now, when I say that, they're taking care of the calves. They have all the marketing decisions, price risk there. They get to do all that with the calves because all the calves are theirs. Now, they still have to take care of those cows based on the agreement that you have with them, or what I would have as the operator with the cow owner, but they have more control in terms of management decisions. They also can retain those calves if they want. They can sell them at weaning. It's very simple. They know the amount of cash they have to come up with and when it's due. With that then comes the disadvantage is that I have to come up with the cash. And when you look at the value of cows today and you look at interest rates, if I'm having to borrow money to go do that, it can be a significant amount. And so we'll actually look at some example cash leases here in a moment and, kind of some ballpark numbers on value. But a cash lease today is much higher than it was 3 years ago, as are interest rates. And so that drives the amount of money I would need to come up with as an operator. So that can be a negative. And of course, I'm accepting all production and price risk. And so that's a disadvantage as well if I'm in a cash lease agreement. On a cow-calf share agreement, the owner is going to get a share of the calf crop. And the advantage to them is they have greater role in management, so they can be involved in the decision-making more. Again, a part of that calf crop is theirs, so they're just more materially invested. And then they have the option of what to do with those calves. They can retain them. If some of those are heifers, they might put them into a replacement development program and breed them. They might retain some of those calves and maybe instead of selling them at weaning, carry them over to yearling or feed them. They have that option, and that's the advantage. Of course, the disadvantage we've already touched on, they're going to share in production and price risk. And then this could be seen both as an advantage and disadvantage, is they're going to be having greater involvement in a working relationship with that operator. That may be something that they don't want to do anymore. They would just as soon not worry about price risk, production risk. They'd like somebody else to take care of all those things and not be involved in any of that day-to-day type decision making. And so that's just the owner's perspective in terms of advantages and disadvantages from a share agreement. In a cow-calf share, the operator, they're going to get a share of the calf crop. And then, of course, the advantage to them is they don't need to come up with cash to lease the cows. Of course, they're sharing in production and price risk. They are going to have to work with that owner in terms of production and marketing. And so those are conversations they're going to need to have that if they were cash leasing the cows, they probably wouldn't need to. They're going to give up a portion of the calf crop. That's a disadvantage. And then they do have less total control. So that's something to be aware of if you're in that agreement in terms of you just have less control of what's going to happen with the calves. So here's the big question I get asked. Somebody will call me, they'll send me an email, they'll walk into my office and say, hey, I'm thinking about a cow-calf share agreement or a cash lease agreement. What's fair? Can you tell me what's fair? Well, whenever someone asks me that, my next question is, well, tell me more about your situation, because you really need to understand all of what's involved to identify what's a fair cash lease or a share agreement. And so the tool that I mentioned earlier, which I think is really nice to do this, it's the Calculator Cow-Calf Share Lease Decision Aid. This is an Excel-based spreadsheet tool. And if you put that web address, go.unl.edu/decision_aids, you can go to a website where you can download this Excel spreadsheet, download it to your computer. The thing I like about this is it allows both the cow owner and the operator to put in what they believe is fair in terms of their contribution. So things like that I'll discuss further for the cow owner, the value of their cows, interest rates, replacement rates, weigh up cow value. For the operator, things like their feed, labor, equipment, management, those things can all go in there. And so this is a spreadsheet that I use a lot in clients I work with, and I really find it to be valuable. So here's just what that website looks like. If you go there, you'll see this cow-calf share lease calculator. You can download that spreadsheet. And I encourage you, when you download it, go ahead and save an original and then save another one that you're going to work in. Then if something gets kind of messed up in that spreadsheet, you can always go back to the original and see what it looked like there. So this is the top part of the spreadsheet. I'm not going to go through and work through it with you. There's a video I've recorded that goes through and does that. You can find that video at the beef website. But this is just an example one that I did recently. And I don't want you to look at this and say, Aaron says that a calf-calf share agreement right now should be 70-30 or 69-31. That's not it at all. Based on the inputs I put in, this is how this agreement worked out. And based on the cow value, interest rates that I put in, somewhere a little north of $300, $325 was a cash lease. If the cow owner in this situation also provided the bulls, we were pushing $380. That was for this particular scenario. But the thing, again, I like about this is that you can put all the inputs in that are involved in the production of weaned calves and figure out what's fair. So as I think about from a cow owner's perspective, what are the major drivers for them in terms of factors that influence what they should get, either as a share of the calf crop or a cash lease? The first one is average cow value. So you as the cow owner have a capital investment in that cow herd. And today that's a significant amount of money. It's increased in value quite a bit over the last 3 years. And again, you have to understand, think about if I was to disperse this cow herd today, if I was to sell everything, take everything to a cow herd dispersal, what do I think I would get? That's your average cow value. Another thing you need to understand is if I enter into a share agreement or a cash lease agreement, what's going to be my expected replacement rate? How many of these cows are going to turn over every year? And if I'm going to maintain the herd, what do I need to bring in terms of replacement, and what's the cost of that? The difference between the value of a cow leaving the herd and the cost to bring in replacement gives you an idea of your cow herd depreciation. And that's an expense. It's a non-cash cost sometimes, especially if you're developing your replacement heifers yourself, but it is a real cost and it needs to be accounted for as you think about a share agreement. The next big one is interest rates. So if you have a capital investment in your cow herd, you could take that cow herd, turn it into cash, and you could take that cash and put it in something else like a certificate of deposit or a money market. And today those are paying somewhere around 5%. That's kind of a baseline interest rate. Well, I think most people would agree that a cow herd has more risk than money in a CD or a money market account. And so you might expect, I think I need to get some rate higher than that on my cow herd. Of course, if you're going out and borrowing money on a cow herd, you're probably looking at 8 to 10% in terms of a cow herd purchase note, or if you're just thinking about operating costs, again, somewhere in that 8 to 10%. So interest rates do significantly impact this cow cash lease agreement or share agreement. And then if you're providing bulls as the cow owner, that's an expense as well. And so you need to take into account, again, what's it cost to purchase a bull? What's the value of the bull when he leaves the herd? How many years do I get of service out of him? How many cows is he being bred to? What's death loss? Things like that. If that's something you're providing as part of the agreement. From the operator's perspective, usually the cow operators can be providing pasture and corn stalks, winter feed. Now, sometimes I work with folks where the cow owner has pasture and they would like to lease both to the operator. And, that in a share agreement, that can be rolled together where the cow owner's providing the pasture so they get a greater percent of the calf crop. Or sometimes I've seen a scenario where the cow operator then actually cash leases the land. It can be set up, but again, understand this is the major cost for the operator's feed. That's usually the number one cost, grazed feed and fed feed of the cow operator. The next one would be their labor and management and equipment. And this sometimes can be a little bit of a sticky one because oftentimes a cow herd owner has built a cow herd up and sometimes they haven't really paid themselves what they were worth in terms of if they were going to go work for someone else and do the work they did for their own cow herd, what would be a market value of that labor? And so sometimes we'll sit down and we'll have a conversation and the cow owner will see what the cow operator values their labor at. And they'll say something like, well, I never paid myself that way. Well, that's true. You own the cows, you were working, you chose not to pay yourself, but that owner's labor may have not been compensated fairly to themselves, but the cow operator, their labor does need to be valued at market value. And so that's part of their contribution to the production of weaned calves. Of course, we have other operating expenses. And then if the cow owner is not providing the bulls, the cow operator is, then that's their contribution. And I typically see that more in scenarios where the cow owner wants to phase out, and maybe a cash lease agreement where the cow operator is providing the bulls, or maybe the cow owner just says, hey, I don't want to mess with bulls. You as the cow operator can do that. And then if that's the case and you're in a share agreement, you're going to need to have some conversation about genetics and what kind of bulls you use. So the bottom line issue is that as you think about either a share or cash lease agreement, all the value that goes into the production of weaned calves needs to be fairly calculated at its market value, both cow owner contribution and cow operator contribution. That's the only way to really arrive at a fair agreement in a share, or what would be fair in terms of cash lease. So you might be wondering, why does Aaron have pictures of pie up in the middle of a cow-calf share and cash lease agreement presentation? Well, the reason is because as you look historically at returns to cow-calf enterprises, economically, they tend to be low. A lot of years they're negative. Some years, like this year, we're going to have a big positive year. But over time, there's not been a lot of net cash income from an economic perspective to go around for cow-calf producers. The return on investment tends to be fairly low. So this year, 2024, calf prices, I've seen calves bringing $1,600 and up in terms of their value at weaning on some of these auction video sales. There's a lot of pie to go around. And so for you as the cow owner and operator, if you have a big pie and you've cut it up and there's a lot to go around, you probably both leave feeling fairly satisfied about how this worked out. However, you go back 3 years to a year like 2021, when calf prices are not where they are today, and you start cutting a pie that's small into pieces, and you both might feel like, well, I got some pie, but I sure didn't get as much as I would have liked to. As you think about setting up an agreement now or renegotiating an agreement, recognize right now that the pie is large. And so this might work pretty well right now as far as a share agreement or a lease agreement. That might look differently a few years down the road when input costs and market value of cattle change. So just recognize that as you think about entering into an agreement. Here's some other things that I think really need to be considered as you think about a share agreement. And this kind of goes without saying, but I think it needs to be really clearly stated. The integrity of both parties is critical. Whether you're the cow owner or you're the operator, this is paramount. If you have any question around whether you can trust this person, you should not enter into an agreement with them. And that's the situation. If you don't know this person, I think you need to ask for references. You need to ask to talk to people they've dealt with in the past. Can you visit with their banker if they're willing to let you do that? Integrity is important. And you're dealing with a lot of dollars. You're making a pretty big investment, both from an operator and owner perspective. And you want to trust the person you're working with. Again, as I've said earlier, this needs to be a win-win long-term. If both of you aren't getting some value out of this, and again, there may be 1 year where one of you feels a little better about it than the other, but if over the long term, it's not win-win, it's not going to work. The other thing is that lenders need to be aware of and understand what the agreement is. So if I'm a cow owner and I'm putting my cows out on lease, and if I have any relationship with the bank at all, I probably need to communicate with them what's happening with those cows. From an operator perspective, same thing. If I'm taking in cows, the banker needs to know these cows are cows I'm leasing. Here's the agreement. Here's how this works. Here's kind of a cash flow based on that. Those cows are going to go back to the owner at some point, or when those cows are sold. Again, that's income to the cow owner, not to me. That needs to be fully discussed and disclosed. Other things that need to be talked about are things like cow-calf care, expectations around cow body condition score in the fall when those cows are preg checked, at the time of calving, cow body condition score at breeding. How are you going to handle sickness and death loss? Who's going to be the consulting veterinarian? If I have a cow that needs a cesarean or I need to take in for a prolapse, who's the vet that's going to do that work? What's our vaccination program going to be? Who's going to pay for that? If we have excessive sickness and death loss, how's that going to be handled? Those things need to be discussed between the cow owner and the operator. Another thing that needs to be talked about is breeding decisions. When are these cows going to calve? How long is the breeding season going to be? What is an acceptable cow breed up? Sometimes I'll work with folks that they put a lot of inputs into their cows, and maybe they have a breed up that's low to mid 90s, and then they work with somebody that takes on those cows that an acceptable breed up in their mind is 88, 89%. Well, if we're talking a 5 to 7% difference in cow breed up in terms of expectation, that's significant, and that needs to be talked about. Culling decisions. How are cows going to be taken out of the herd? Are we going to call only cows that are not pregnant? Or are we also going to cull for things like disposition, feet and leg structure, cows that have bad udders? Are those cows going to leave the herd as well? Sometimes I work with folks that they're willing to tolerate a cow that maybe has a big teat, and they'll help that cow at calving, get that calf started for a couple days. The cow weans a big calf. They're fine with it. The cow operator might not want to mess with that. They've got a lot of things to do. They'll have time for that. So those kind of things need to be talked about in terms of culling decisions. Replacements. How are replacement cows going to be brought into the herd? Are they going to be bred heifers? Are they going to be middle-aged cows or old cows? What's the source of those? Are we, what's the biosecurity risks or things that need to be taken into account as we bring cows in? Are they going to be heifer calves that are developed from the cow herd? If that's going to happen, who's going to develop those? Is the cow operator going to be expected to do that? I'll talk about that a little bit more, but that needs to be discussed. If you're in a share agreement, how are calves going to be divided? And when is that going to occur? I remember a couple years ago, I had a cow operator call me who was looking at a share agreement with an individual. This was not in Nebraska. It was a Western state. They were taking in the cows. They were going to get a share of the calf crop, but the cow owner wanted the calves to carry all of his brand. So the cow operator did not have any of those calves that had his brand on it. And he said, I don't know that legally I have any protection as far as not if those calves don't carry my brand. And so we talked about that, and he was going to have to wrestle through that with the cow owner and somehow come up to something they both could agree on. At branding time, do those calves carry the owner's brand, or do they carry the operator's brand, or do you split up the calves at branding time and certain number get the owner's brand and certain number get the operator's brand? Those are things that need to be talked about in a share agreement. Division of calves at weaning, if you divide them then, how's that going to occur? Are you going to do a gate cut? Are you going to do a I pick two, you pick one kind of scenario? Those things need to be discussed. Hauling and marketing of calves, hauling and marketing of weigh-up cows, cull cows, how that's going to occur, when, those things need to be talked about also. Another thing that I think is really important is to talk through what are expected results. What are we expecting in terms of a calf crop weaned per cow exposed? And things like death loss, preg rates, those cow body condition score at calving, at weaning, during the breeding season, those things need to be discussed. And then I would say also have a conversation about an exit plan. So we can be pretty good about, okay, let's get together and enter into this agreement, but we also need to, I think, talk through when it's time to dissolve this. How's that going to happen? How's notification going to occur? How soon is it going to occur? Those things need to be talked about. And then I'm a big proponent of you need to have this in writing. And I know a lot of folks say if you can't trust the person, you can't trust their signature on a piece of paper. And I understand that. But by having an agreement in writing, by you as the operator and as the cow owner, there's then not any question about what's been agreed to. And it provides legal protection for both of you. When an agreement's been put together, it's been reviewed by an attorney, it's been notarized and signed, then in the event that something happens to one of you that's unexpected, let's say one of you is killed in a car accident, then it's very clear to whoever's settling the estate or dealing with that of what your agreement is, and it just provides you protection. The other thing I'm a big proponent of is I really encourage that leases or share agreements have some clause in there where they're going to be annually reviewed and potentially adjusted. The reason for that is if you think about the last 10 years in the cattle industry, we've seen tremendous volatility in prices and input costs. And so to enter into a long-term agreement and not have the opportunity to make an adjustment, I think just puts both the cow owner and the operator in a position where it could be really to their detriment. So again, this has to be win-win. And by being able to review those annually, make adjustment, hopefully you're coming up with something that long-term works for both parties. The other thing I'd encourage is to identify a third-party mediator, someone who maybe actually is present when you have that conversation annually, or if you get into a sticky place where you're not in agreement, is someone you both trust and has some knowledge that can help bring some perspective as you try to maybe iron out some differences you have in your agreement. I often work with folks as they sit down, especially families, and talk about entering into agreement. They'll come to my office and we'll sit down and we'll just talk through things. And oftentimes I'll ask questions and say, have you considered this? Or have you thought about this kind of situation? And sometimes it'll bring up an issue or a circumstance that they need to talk about and get some clarity on before they enter into the agreement. Now, I've already mentioned this earlier, but one of the things that comes up sometimes is what about replacements? And I think this is one where if you're a cow owner and you're in a share agreement and you want to retain replacement heifer calves, have those developed and then bring them into the herd, and your expectation is that the cow operator is going to do that, I strongly encourage you to have that be two separate agreements. Maybe you have a cow-calf share agreement and then you'll have a heifer development agreement. So at weaning, you've selected some heifers that you want the cow operator to take and develop and then expose them to breeding and then bring those breds in, have that be a separate agreement. I've seen some times where people try to mix the two together, and honestly, it just gets real complicated and it becomes difficult. Now, maybe you know of a scenario where that can work out well and it's real clear about the costs, the inputs, about what occurs with that. But I really encourage folks to have those be two separate agreements. Another question that just comes up, and we've touched on this earlier, is again, where are those replacements going to come from? I've already touched on, the importance of, is that going to be bred heifers or cows? What's the source of those? Is this some onesie twosies picked up at the local sale barn? Or is it a package of females from a known source? Those things, again, need to be talked about. And so both parties know what the expectations are. So if you're looking for more information on this topic, if you go to the beef.unl.edu website, there's a number of articles there. There's a NEB guide there that I've written on this topic that has a sample lease agreement in it. It's not a legal document, and its purpose is not to be that. It's really an example that you can take information from and then use also other lease agreements that are out there as examples, like aglease101.org. They have a very detailed cow-calf share cash lease agreement. So I really encourage you to look at some sample agreements, and maybe you can even find an agreement that someone else has written. Find the parts and pieces that you like, add to where you think maybe it's not complete, and then take that to an attorney, have them write it up in a legal language that you understand, that the operator understands, and then sign it, have it notarized, have it be a legal document that you both have agreed to. And so those are a couple of resources on thinking about putting together an actual lease. And then, as I said earlier, if you go to the beef website, there's a video that walks through that cow-calf share lease calculator, explains how it works, explains some of the advantages and disadvantages that we've talked about again in this webinar today, and can help you as you get started if you want to use that Excel-based spreadsheet tool as a way to start to work on identifying what's a fair share or cash lease value for your cows. The other thing I've got on the screen here is my contact information. Again, I'm happy to visit with you as an owner, as an operator. Maybe sit down with both of you, could set up a meeting via Zoom, and we could just talk through your scenario. I've worked with folks frequently on this and have had quite a few different scenarios that I've had the opportunity to interact with. And so can maybe bring up some thoughts or ideas that you might want to consider as you think about your own share or cash lease agreement. So with that, Randy, I think we can open it up. If there's any questions that have come in, I'll be happy to answer those.
So right now, Aaron, I don't see any on my list.
Okay.
A question for you: as cattle prices are high, we see maybe more interest in people wanting to do share leased. But on the other end, when cattle prices are low, we see just the opposite. So a long-term lease, you're probably going to get the highs and the lows, right? So how do you adjust for that?
Yeah, so I think as you think about adjusting the share lease or a cash lease, I think you need to annually look at like that share lease spreadsheet and you just walk through and say, for example, 3 years ago, you could buy a lot of bred cows for $1,500 to $1,800. Those same cows today are probably $2,200 to $2,800. Cow values have increased, and just like I shared, interest rates have gone up. Well, if you're thinking about a cash lease, a cow owner today might have been willing to lease cows for $180 3 years ago based on interest rates and cow value. Today, that value is probably closer to 300 or 325. Well, that's a pretty drastic difference. But you also think about then the value of calves today, that's gone up a lot as well. So I think that's where you need to, if you're going to enter an agreement, recognize we could have, it looks good right now. We need to be willing to adjust this annually and then recognize there may be some years that both of us feel like, we didn't get out of this all that we would have liked to. And I have seen, as you referenced, Randy, folks enter into share agreements or cash lease agreements in times like this. Then 3, 4, 5 years down the road, they're like, you know what, this isn't working well anymore. We don't know that we want to continue to do this. So I think recognizing that in light of the cyclical nature of cow prices and the industry is important. And that's why I really encourage folks in a lease or share agreement be willing to renegotiate that or at least revisit it annually.
Thanks, Aaron. Right now, I'm not seeing any questions. I'm watching. So if you have questions, either do it in the Q&A or you can do it in the chat, either one, and we will get them answered. So normally when do, oh, here we go. Here's a question.
Yeah, so I know that in the chat box, Ryan Evans put in
Yep.
that Go website link. And so you can even click on that now. And if you want to find that web page that we talked about the share lease agreement, you can easily find that website. And if you want to bookmark that, you can go back and download that spreadsheet at a later time.
So I've got a question. Okay.
Okay.
How would you look at taking care of cattle in winter if an owner has pasture but not a place to winter?
Okay. Yeah, good question. So I think, again, I think you need to look at is the cow owner going to provide the summer pasture? In this case, that's what I'm assuming is the situation. And then, you need to look at your winter costs. So typically, and again, it depends on what the situation is. Are these January, February calving cows? Are they April, May calving cows? Are we going to be having on corn stalks? Are we going to be feeding harvested feed? That's significantly different a lot of times in the cost involved. So be real about what those costs are. And then, if you're primarily taking care of those cows in the winter, you're calving them, your labor requirements then are going to be higher as far as cow days than they are in the summertime. So make sure you quantify, value that fairly as well. And I think that is something you just need to talk through either as the owner or operator, recognize the differences in cost and time of year and care. It takes a lot more labor at calving time than it does in the middle of the summer. Recognize the differences of that and value those appropriately.
I've got another one. I got another one here. Why lease over custom cash care from the caregiver standpoint?
Yeah. So if you cash lease, you get the calves and you get to do what you would like with those calves. You can capture potentially more value from them. You might want to be building a herd of your own, and so you can have those genetics. There's probably more flexibility than also from an income standpoint. If you're cash leasing, you're getting cash, that's income. And, if you're getting the calves, then you can choose to sell those calves or you can retain them. You could build a cow herd by keeping the heifer calves, build equity. And so there's some income variances there in terms of what you can do whether it's a custom cash care or a lease agreement.
Okay, I've got one more. So thanks for a great webinar. Do you see more interest in share or cash leases from producers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So oftentimes initially I'll talk with folks and they think about a share agreement. And that's usually how people come to it. They say, I'm interested in a share agreement. However, when I talk through with them, then, have you thought about a cash lease? Then I'll see sometimes more interest in a cash lease. And the thing about a cash lease is it's very simple, it's straightforward and clean. And I've had that conversation actually with some family members where maybe we've got an older generation that wants to bring in a younger generation. And as sometimes can happen, there's not always agreement between the older generation and the younger generation about how things should be done. Or there's just a desire by the younger generation to have autonomy and decision making, and they don't want the older generation or to feel like they're looking over their shoulder telling them what to do. And I had a conversation with somebody about that recently where the older generation said, you know what, I think maybe a cash lease agreement would be better for us. Then it's just clear that we get X amount of dollars. My daughter can take care of the cows. They can make the decisions, and there's not any going back and forth about management. And so sometimes that's the advantages and disadvantages. To be honest, a share agreement in my mind is more complicated. There's just more pieces involved, more things to keep track of, more interaction that needs to happen between the owner and the operator. That can be a good thing, and oftentimes is, especially if the younger generation's needing some mentoring. And also you think about the older generation, they have relationships, they've got experience, they've been there, done that. And so if you have someone that's teachable, that can be an advantage to the younger generation as well. So hopefully that kind of gives some perspective about that, but that's kind of how I see that. In terms of what I see done, it varies greatly just depending on the scenario.
So I have another question. What should be the minimum or maximum length of the agreement?
Yeah, that's great. Great question. So, I think if you think about from an operator's perspective, if I'm going to take on cows, usually I probably want that to be longer than a 1-year deal. Now, there might be scenarios where maybe I only got cash or only have pasture lease for a year, or I'm on a year-to-year deal, and maybe we only agree to a year. But most folks, if they're going to take on cows, they'd probably like it to be, a 3-year deal or potentially a 5-year deal. Now, that having been said, I've seen scenarios where some folks say, hey, we're going to commit to a year. We'd like this to be longer, but let's see how this goes. And we're going to revisit this. We both know that we'd like it to be longer, but we want to see how this goes. So I guess I'm kind of sounding like it depends, and I think it does. But again, usually I works with folks, a 3 to 5 years, kind of a window of time that often we talk about initially. Sometimes it can be a little longer than that. But if you think about an average cow herd, if you think about a 5-year agreement, if you're starting with 2-year-olds today, 5 years from now, they're 7, there's not going to be a lot of cows left. And so sometimes I've seen agreements where it's a cash lease and the owner is going to work out of the agreement over time. As cows leave the herd, the cow operator is going to replace them with their own cows. And usually by year 5 or 6, they don't have a lot of cows left. And then maybe the cow operator agrees to buy the remaining cows or something like that. So that maybe helps bring some perspective on length of time.
So I have another question. Are you mostly seeing a 70-30 split or close to that?
Yeah. I hesitate to say here's what the split should be, because as I work with folks, it really varies on their inputs. When cows calve, what's the feed cost? For example, if I've got January, February calving cows, my harvested feed cost is probably much higher than if I'm working with somebody that runs cows on stocks and, maybe they're late April, May calving cows. So it varies. I would say that because of the increase in cow value and interest rates, cow owners are getting a larger share today or a higher cash value than they were 3 years ago, just because of the capital investment they have and the interest rate they should expect to get. And frankly, just the cost of cow depreciation. You look at, even with these high weigh-up cow prices. If I sell a cow for $1,500 as a weigh-up cow, that sounds pretty good, and it is. But if I then need to go and replace her with a $3,000 bred heifer, there's $1,500 of depreciation there that I have to come up with. So depreciation, interest today are much larger than they were 3 years ago. And so typically I see cow owners getting more today than they were 3 years ago when I looked at a cash lease or share agreement then.
So this is an anonymous attendee. It says, just a statement, and I don't know who this is. When preparing an agreement to clearly identify where risk lies with a livestock or even grass, USDA has the livestock programs that needs to determine where the risk lies, I think is what he means.
Yeah.
Livestock or or the pasture or whatever.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So as you think about your agreements, and if you have programs in place, if you're working with those programs, make sure you also have a conversation with your FSA director and say, how do we need to word this so that we are eligible for the program? So, technically, if I own the cows and I'm on a cash lease agreement, I've set aside risk, and the cow operators taking that on. And so they should be the ones, in my mind, eligible for the programs. But as you think about programs like pasture range and forage insurance, as you think about NAP, as you think about livestock risk protection insurance on calves, if it just needs to be clear, if you're working with an FSA program, that you understand what their expectations are, if there's needed documentation around risk. Yeah, great comment. Other questions?
So right now I have no other questions. We'll see if I get some more in, but
okay. Right. Well, those were great questions. If there's some that come to mind after the end of our presentation today, you're sure welcome to give me a call, send me an email. Be happy to visit with you. Again, I think there's a lot of really good resources at our beef.unl.edu website. And so I would encourage you to get those if you'd like. I've got those kind of all put together in an email package as well. And so if you'd like that, shoot me an email and I'd be happy to send that on to you so you could easily have those all in one place.
Sounds good. Here's another question. We got another one. No, I guess not. I was looking at the bottom. So nope, we don't. So we give it a few more minutes and then we'll close out.
Yeah, I guess give folks another minute here. If another thought comes to mind or question you have, let me know.
And you're sure welcome to email Aaron if we don't get your question answered. He'd be glad to answer. Hopefully I'm okay seeing that, Aaron, but I know that as an educator, we get a lot of those questions later sometimes.
Yep. And again, I think the important thing to me is, as you think about an agreement, make sure you put it in writing, make sure you discuss not only the things we talked about today, but anything else that could be in concern. I would really caution you against well, it'll just work out attitude. That is a recipe for potential conflict. And so as much as you can, there are going to be things that come up that you hadn't thought about, but as much as you can, talk through all the things you can beforehand. And again, putting it in writing, just make sure that everyone's on the same page.
And sometimes we see even people, if they're renting the pasture from the owner, they didn't do anything for weeds or they didn't do anything for thistles. And so you need to consider those kind of things in your lease if you're doing that, because if it's not in there, there's probably not going to be anything happen.
Yeah. So one of the questions that came in was, do I see more demand for this with aging ranchers in cash or in a cash situation or lease? And I would say in the last year here, I've seen some ranchers that are looking to get out of the day-to-day management and ownership of, I should say ownership, day-to-day management and just day-to-day labor. And they still want to participate in these good calf prices here short term. And so I have seen some interest in that. Again, the thing I think I'd really encourage people to think about, if you're looking to get out of the labor, have a conversation with your tax preparer about your options. And I really see three. You could sell the cow herd today or this fall. You could have a complete dispersal. What would be the tax ramifications of that? And maybe you sell half the cow herd prior to the first of the year, half after. What's the capital gains if they're raised cows? What's the capital gains tax on that? Then compare that to, well, what if I entered into a share agreement? And what would be the tax implications of that? Or if I entered into a cash lease, how would that look? Talking through those options with your tax preparer, understanding how that would look and the advantages and disadvantages of those, I think is really important. Sometimes I'll have people call and say, well, I don't want to pay much taxes, so I want to enter into some kind of share deal or cash lease, and I want to work out of this cow herd over time. And I can understand that perspective. But candidly, I've seen some scenarios at time when you look at cow depreciation, and you also look at if you're taking those calves as income, that's taxed as ordinary income. It's not as capital gains income. And so the tax advantage you think you may be getting by retaining ownership of those cows and being either in a share lease agreement or cash lease may not be the real value that you expected it to be when you actually compare things like cow depreciation and looking at capital gains rates right now on selling a cow herd. So again, sit down, have a conversation with your tax preparer, understand clearly what your options are and the implications of those. Just don't automatically think, well, I'm going to save money on taxes if I do a share lease or cash lease. That may not be the case. So just know that and understand it.
Well,
All
if
right.
no further questions, we'll get ready to end the webinar. Again, you can get a hold of Aaron. We just want to thank you for joining us today. Look for this recording in the next 24 hours in the archive section of the Center for Ag Profitability Webinars page at cap.unl.edu/webinars. When you close your Zoom window, you'll see a short survey that we would really appreciate your feedback on. It only takes a moment to complete, and your responses are very valued. And we do use that a lot to see where, how we did, what we needed to improve on, and what topics you might want. So thanks again for joining us. Please fill out the evaluation. It's very helpful to us as educators and as a university to make sure we're on the right track. Aaron, you have any final comments?
No, again, just would encourage folks, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out either by email or phone, and I'd be happy to answer those.
Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next Thursday.